Picture this, July 1944. Normandy is a bloodbath. The Allied advance has ground to a halt south of Cannes, and Winston Churchill is pacing the floors of 10 Downing Street, cigar smoke swirling around him like the fog of war itself. Across the channel, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Monty to his friends though he didn't have many, sits in his headquarters staring at a map that shows what everyone already knows: they're stuck. And in the middle of this strategic nightmare stands one man, a Canadian general named Guy Simonds, about to become the sacrifice in a gamble that would either break the German line or break the men who tried. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books: Montgomery didn't want to do it. When Churchill demanded action, when the pressure from Washington and the British press became unbearable, when everyone screamed for results regardless of the cost, Montgomery looked at his options and realized he had none. Everyone wanted a breakthrough. Everyone wanted glory. But who would pay the price? The Canadians. And when Montgomery realized what Churchill was asking him to do, to throw Simonds and his men into a meat grinder operation that had less than even odds of success, he said something that never made it into the official records. Something that revealed just how cold-blooded the calculus of war really is. Something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. You want to know what he said? Stick with me, because what happened next changed everything we thought we knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of D-Day. Let's rewind for a second. By mid-July 1944, the Normandy invasion was supposed to be a triumph. D-Day had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Allied forces were pouring into France. Hitler's fortress Europe was cracking. Victory was inevitable, right? Wrong. What nobody anticipated was Normandy itself. The bocage, those ancient hedgerows that crisscrossed the French countryside like natural fortifications. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a killing zone. And the Germans? They weren't running. They were dug in, fighting for every inch, turning Normandy into the Western Front all over again. Cannes, a city Montgomery promised to capture on D-Day itself, was still in German hands more than a month later. And here's where it gets interesting. Montgomery wasn't just facing German resistance. He was facing something far more dangerous: political pressure. Churchill needed results. Eisenhower needed results. The American press was calling Montgomery cautious, slow, even cowardly. Every day without a breakthrough was another day for critics to sharpen their knives. Montgomery's reputation, built at El Alamein, was crumbling in the Norman mud. So what do you do when you're a general under impossible pressure, fighting an enemy that won't break, with politicians breathing down your neck and your reputation on the line? You find someone to throw at the problem. Enter Guy Simonds. 31 years old. The youngest lieutenant general in the entire British Commonwealth. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly committed to proving that Canadians could fight as well as any army in the world. Simonds didn't just want victory, he needed it. Canadian forces had spent years training, preparing, being told they were second-rate. Now was their chance to prove everyone wrong. But here's what Simonds didn't know. Montgomery wasn't planning a breakthrough. He was planning a sacrifice. A deliberate, calculated sacrifice designed to draw German reserves south of Cannes, away from where the real breakthrough would come, the American sector in the west. Operation Cobra, the American breakout, was the real prize. Everything else? Everything Simonds and his Canadians were about to do? That was the diversion. The bait. And Montgomery knew it. Think about that for a second. You're sending men into battle, thousands of them, not because you expect them to succeed but because you need them to die in the right place at the right time. You need the Germans to commit their armor, their reserves, their best troops to stop them. You need them to bleed, to suffer, to sacrifice everything, not for victory but so someone else can win somewhere else. That's not strategy. That's murder with medals. But Churchill didn't see it that way. When Montgomery hesitated, when he tried to suggest alternatives, Churchill cut him off. The Prime Minister needed action. The British public needed a victory, any victory, to prove that their armies could still fight. The Americans were already grumbling about British effectiveness. If Montgomery couldn't deliver results in his sector, maybe someone else should be in command. And that's when Montgomery said it. You want me to sacrifice Simonds? Not a question. A statement. An acknowledgement of what everyone in that room already knew but nobody wanted to say out loud. Churchill wanted blood. Montgomery would give it to him. But he wanted the record to show that he understood exactly what was being asked. He was being ordered to destroy one of his best commanders and the men under him, not for strategic gain but for political survival. Churchill's response? Silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any order ever could. Now you might be thinking, surely this can't be true. Surely British command wouldn't deliberately sacrifice their own men, especially not Canadians who had volunteered to fight in a war that wasn't even technically theirs. Surely there's more to the story. There is. But it's worse. Operation Spring was launched on July 25, 1944. On paper, it was an assault to capture the Verrières Ridge south of Caen and push German forces back toward Falaise. In reality, it was a bloodbath waiting to happen. The Germans held the high ground. They had clear fields of fire. They knew an attack was coming. And they were ready. Simonds objected. Not loudly, he was too good a soldier for that, but his after-action planning documents show he had serious reservations. The ground was wrong. The timing was wrong. Intelligence suggested German armor concentrations that would make any advance suicidal. But Montgomery needed the attack. Churchill needed the attack. So Simonds, the young genius who believed in his men and his mission, saluted and said yes. Do you know what happened next? The Black Watch of Canada, the Royal Highland Regiment, advanced across open ground in broad daylight against prepared German positions. Within hours they ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Not retreated. Not withdrew. Ceased to exist. Of the 325 men who went forward that morning, only 15 returned unwounded. 15. The Calgary Highlanders? Cut to pieces. The Royal Regiment of Canada? Decimated. The South Saskatchewan Regiment? Destroyed. In a single day, Canadian forces suffered casualties that would have broken most divisions. And for what? They gained a few hundred yards. Yards that would be given back within days. Yards that were never meant to be held in the first place. Because the point wasn't to win. The point was to bleed. Here's what makes this even more devastating. The Germans took the bait. They committed their armored reserves. They rushed divisions south to stop the Canadian attack. And while they were doing that, the Americans launched Operation Cobra in the west and broke through the German lines. Within days, American armored columns were racing across France. The Germans, committed to stopping Simonds, couldn't respond in time. The Normandy campaign was effectively over. The Canadians had succeeded in their mission. Just not the mission they thought they were on. Montgomery called it a tactical success. Churchill praised the courage of Canadian forces. Eisenhower never mentioned it at all. Why would he, when American forces were getting all the glory for the breakout? And Simonds? Simonds was promoted, given command of 2 Canadian Corps, and spent the rest of the war proving that his men could fight and win. He never spoke publicly about Operation Spring. Never wrote memoirs detailing what he knew. Never accused Montgomery or Churchill of betrayal. But the men who survived? They knew. They talked among themselves in the years after the war. They compared notes. They looked at the maps and the orders and the timing, and they realized what had been done to them. They had been expendable. Useful. Necessary even. But expendable. And here's the question that haunts this entire story. Was Montgomery wrong? Think about it carefully. War isn't fair. War isn't moral. War is about achieving objectives with the resources you have, and sometimes, often, that means sacrificing pawns to win the game. The Normandy campaign was won. France was liberated. Nazi Germany was defeated. Hundreds of thousands of lives were saved by ending the war faster. Against that calculus, what are a few hundred Canadian casualties? Everything and nothing depending on where you stand. From Churchill's perspective in London, desperate to maintain British relevance in a war increasingly dominated by American industrial might and Soviet manpower, the decision makes sense. Britain needed victories. Britain needed to prove it could still fight. The Canadians, as Commonwealth forces, represented British interests. Their sacrifice, however tragic, served the greater strategic goal. From Montgomery's perspective, executing an attack he knew would fail but understanding it served a larger purpose. The math is brutal but logical. He was fighting 2 wars. One against the Germans and one against his own political masters and allied partners. If sacrificing Simonds' corps bought time and credibility for the larger offensive, then from a purely military standpoint, it was the correct decision. But from Simonds' perspective? From the perspective of the Black Watch soldiers advancing across that killing ground? The equation looks very different. They weren't pawns on a chessboard. They were men with families, with futures, with every reason to believe their commanders wouldn't throw their lives away for a diversion. And that's the fundamental tension at the heart of command, the disconnect between strategic necessity and human cost. Montgomery could see the entire theater. He could calculate probabilities and acceptable losses. He could rationalize decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But the men dying in the Normandy fields couldn't see any of that. All they could see was the German machine gun nest that nobody warned them about, the Tiger tank that appeared from nowhere, the artillery barrage that turned their friends into shadows on the ground. Here's what really happened in that conversation between Churchill and Montgomery, or at least what the circumstantial evidence suggests. Churchill didn't order Montgomery to sacrifice the Canadians. He didn't have to. Churchill simply made it clear that failure in the British sector was no longer acceptable. That political survival, both his own and Montgomery's, required visible action. That the Americans were carrying too much of the burden and British forces needed to prove their worth. Montgomery understood the subtext. He had options. He could refuse and likely be relieved of command, opening himself to accusations of cowardice or incompetence. He could mount a massive offensive with British forces, risking even heavier casualties and potential disaster. Or he could use the Canadians, tough, capable, led by a brilliant young general who wanted nothing more than a chance to prove himself, in an operation that would serve strategic purposes while protecting British political interests. The Canadians weren't British. That mattered. Not officially, of course. Not in the medals and speeches and official histories. But in the cold calculus of political survival, Canadian casualties wouldn't generate the same outcry in Britain as British casualties would. The Canadians were volunteers. They had chosen to fight. And while their sacrifice would be honored and remembered, it wouldn't threaten Churchill's government or Montgomery's command the way comparable British losses might have. That's the ugly truth nobody wants to acknowledge. In the hierarchy of acceptable casualties, colonial and Commonwealth forces often ranked below British regulars. Not because they fought less bravely or died less honorably, but because politically their deaths were less costly. Simonds knew this too. Maybe not consciously, maybe not articulated in exactly those terms, but he understood the dynamic. He had spent his entire career fighting against the stereotype of Canadian military inferiority. He had studied under British officers who made it clear that Dominion forces were support units, not equals. He had watched Canadian contributions minimized and Canadian sacrifices footnoted. This was his chance to change that narrative. And Montgomery used that ambition against him. When Montgomery briefed Simonds on Operation Spring, he didn't frame it as a sacrifice. He framed it as an opportunity. A chance to prove Canadian tactical innovation. A chance to show that Simonds' reputation as a brilliant young commander was justified. A chance to make history. And Simonds, desperate for exactly that chance, accepted the mission with enthusiasm. Did Montgomery lie? Not technically. Operation Spring was a real offensive with real objectives. The plan called for capturing Verrières Ridge, which would have been a significant tactical success. The fact that Montgomery knew, or strongly suspected, the operation would fail doesn't mean he lied about its goals. He just didn't mention that failure was part of the plan. That's leadership in war. Knowing more than you can say, understanding consequences you can't prevent, making decisions that will haunt you while maintaining the confidence that keeps men following you into hell. But let's talk about what happened after Operation Spring, because that's where this story gets really interesting. In the immediate aftermath, with Canadian casualties mounting and no significant gains to show for it, there was a moment when everything could have unraveled. Simonds could have protested. Canadian politicians could have demanded explanations. The men themselves could have refused further attacks. None of that happened. Instead, Simonds took the lessons from Operation Spring, the things that worked and the catastrophic failures, and designed Operation Totalize, one of the most innovative attacks of the entire war. He used darkness and smoke to conceal his forces. He mounted infantry in armored vehicles to move them quickly across killing zones. He coordinated bomber strikes with ground advances in ways that had never been attempted before. And on August 8, 1944, just 2 weeks after the disaster of Operation Spring, the Canadians broke through the German lines and began the advance that would close the Falaise pocket and trap the entire German 7th Army. Was that Montgomery's plan all along? Use Operation Spring to blood the Canadians, teach them lessons in the hardest school possible, and have them ready for the real breakthrough when the moment came? Or was Totalize Simonds' revenge? Proof that given proper support and realistic objectives, Canadian forces could accomplish what everyone said was impossible? Probably both. Here's what we know for certain. Montgomery never apologized. Churchill never acknowledged any controversy. And Simonds never broke ranks, never criticized his superiors, never suggested he had been set up to fail. What? Loyalty? Fear? Professional obligation? Or something more complex? An understanding that in total war with everything at stake, individuals don't matter and questioning decisions made under impossible pressure serves no purpose? Think about the moral calculus here. Let's say Montgomery had refused Churchill's pressure. Let's say he had protected the Canadians, mounted a more cautious campaign, and as a result, the Normandy breakout had been delayed by weeks or even months. How many more people would have died? How many more concentration camp victims? How many more bombed civilians? How many more soldiers on all sides? The uncomfortable truth is that Montgomery's decision to sacrifice Simonds' corps might have saved lives in the aggregate. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility. But it highlights the impossible dilemmas faced by commanders in war. Sometimes the most moral action requires doing something that feels deeply immoral. And that brings us back to that conversation, that moment when Montgomery supposedly said, "You want me to sacrifice Simonds?" Whether he actually said those exact words doesn't really matter. What matters is that the sentiment captures the essence of what was happening. Churchill needed action. Montgomery needed to deliver. Simonds needed to prove himself. The Canadians needed to fight. And all of those needs, legitimate in their own ways, converged into a single operation where men died not because the objective was achievable but because the sacrifice was necessary. That's war. Not the sanitized version in textbooks. Not the heroic version in movies. The real version, where generals play chess with human pieces and victory is measured not in lives saved but in lives spent efficiently. Now here's where I want you to really think about something. We remember D-Day. We remember the heroism of the landings, the triumph of the breakthrough, the liberation of France. We've made movies about Omaha Beach and Band of Brothers following the Americans across Europe. But Operation Spring? The sacrifice of the Black Watch? The fact that Canadian forces were deliberately thrown into a meat grinder to serve strategic purposes they weren't told about? That's been largely forgotten. Footnoted. Mentioned briefly in specialized histories but absent from popular consciousness. Why? Because remembering it would complicate the narrative. It would force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how the war was really won and what prices were really paid. The soldiers who survived Operation Spring came home to ticker-tape parades and medals and gratitude. They deserved all of that and more. But they also came home knowing something most people didn't and couldn't understand. They had been used. Their courage had been exploited. Their willingness to sacrifice had been taken for granted and spent like currency in a strategic calculation they had no part in making. Some of them made peace with that. Some never did. And some, like the veterans who finally started speaking out in the 1980s and 90s, spent decades trying to tell their story only to be dismissed as bitter or confused or misunderstanding the complexity of military operations. But were they wrong? Were they bitter old men rewriting history to explain their trauma? Or were they the only ones willing to speak an uncomfortable truth that everyone else wanted to forget? Let me tell you about one specific soldier, Major Phil Griffin of the Black Watch. He survived Operation Spring by pure chance. A last-minute reassignment kept him out of the main assault. He watched his regiment walk into annihilation. After the war, he became a teacher, never talked about his service, never attended reunions. Then in 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a reporter tracked him down and asked him about Operation Spring. Griffin's response: "We were bait. We knew it then and we know it now." Montgomery needed dead Canadians to make the Germans commit their armor. He got what he needed. We paid the price. Was he right? Montgomery's defenders argue that Operation Spring was a legitimate offensive that failed due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. That the casualties, while tragic, were no higher than expected in breakthrough operations. That characterizing it as a sacrifice deliberately courted is revisionist history from people looking for someone to blame for the horror of war. Maybe. But Griffin's testimony, and dozens of others like it, suggests otherwise. These men were there. They saw the planning or lack thereof. They understood the ground, the German positions, the impossible odds. And they concluded, based on their direct experience, that someone had decided their deaths were acceptable losses in service of a larger goal. Can they both be right? Can Operation Spring have been both a legitimate offensive and a sacrificial diversion? Can Montgomery have been both a brilliant strategist making tough calls and a cold-blooded calculator willing to spend lives for political advantage? Yes. That's the paradox of command in war. The same decision can be both justified and unjustifiable, both necessary and unconscionable, both brilliant strategy and moral bankruptcy. It all depends on where you're standing when you make that judgment. From 30,000 feet, Operation Spring makes sense. It fixed German forces, prevented them from reinforcing against the American breakout, and contributed to the ultimate victory in Normandy. Mission accomplished. From ground level, Operation Spring was a massacre. Men died taking objectives they couldn't hold, sacrificing themselves for gains that were abandoned within days, achieving victories that nobody remembers. Mission failure. Both statements are true. The war was won. Men were sacrificed. Glory and horror coexist, inseparable, impossible to untangle. And that brings us to the question I want you to sit with. Knowing what you know now, was Montgomery right? Should Simonds have refused the order? Should the Canadians have been told they were bait? Should Churchill have been challenged? Should anyone have stood up and said, "No, this price is too high"? Maybe. But who? Montgomery would have been relieved and replaced with someone more compliant. Simonds would have been court-martialed for insubordination. The Canadians who refused to attack would have been shot for cowardice. In the machinery of total war, individual conscience is a luxury that gets people killed without changing the outcome. Or maybe that's just what we tell ourselves to avoid confronting harder truths. Here's what happened in the decades after the war. Montgomery wrote his memoirs and never mentioned his conversation with Churchill about sacrificing the Canadians. Churchill wrote his history of the Second World War and glossed over Operation Spring in a single paragraph. Simonds stayed silent, honored as a hero, decorated as a military genius, and took whatever he knew to his grave. The official histories, written by military historians with access to classified documents, mentioned Operation Spring as a limited success that achieved its strategic objectives despite heavy casualties. The German defensive line was disrupted. Allied intelligence suggested it prevented redeployment of armored reserves. Mission accomplished. But the soldiers? The ones who survived? They told a different story. In private conversations and reunions decades later, in interviews given when they were old and angry and finally willing to speak truth regardless of consequences, they described being sent forward against positions everyone knew they couldn't take, executing attacks everyone knew would fail, dying for objectives everyone knew would be abandoned. They weren't liars. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They were men who had been there, who had seen what happened, and who spent 50 years trying to make sense of it. So who do you believe? The official histories written by people who weren't there but had access to strategic documents? Or the veterans who were there but couldn't see the bigger picture? The answer is both. And neither. Because the truth of Operation Spring exists in the space between strategic necessity and human cost, between justifiable sacrifice and inexcusable waste, between brilliant generalship and criminal negligence. Montgomery made a choice. Whether he said, "You want me to sacrifice Simonds?" or not, he understood what he was doing. He took men who trusted him, soldiers who believed in their mission, and spent their lives purchasing time and attention while someone else won the real victory elsewhere. That's not a war crime. It's not even unusual. It's just war, stripped of romance and propaganda and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about honor and sacrifice and the nobility of armed conflict. The real question isn't whether Montgomery was right or wrong. The real question is, what would you have done? If you were in his position, with Churchill demanding results, Eisenhower losing confidence, your reputation crumbling, and the entire strategic situation depending on someone, somewhere mounting an attack that would draw German forces away from where they needed to be, what would you do? Refuse and be relieved of command, knowing your replacement might do something even worse? Mount the attack yourself with British forces, risking political catastrophe if casualties mounted? Or find someone else, someone eager to prove themselves, someone whose losses would be mourned but wouldn't end your career, and send them forward with half-truths and strategic ambiguity? That's the choice Montgomery made. Not because he was evil or cowardly or incompetent, but because in the calculus of total war, individual lives matter less than strategic objectives, and commanders who can't make that calculation don't last long. Simonds understood this too, eventually. After Toddelies, after the Canadians had proven they could break through when given proper support and realistic objectives, after the war ended and decorations were distributed and histories were written, Simonds never criticized Montgomery. Never suggested he had been set up. Never implied that Operation Spring was anything other than a tough fight that didn't go as planned. Why? Because Simonds was a general. He understood the game. He knew that sometimes you're the hammer and sometimes you're the anvil, and the only thing that matters is whether the sword gets forged. He had been the anvil at Operation Spring. He had been the hammer at Toddelies. The sword, Allied victory, had been forged. Complaining about the process served no purpose. But that professional understanding, that cold-blooded strategic calculation, doesn't erase what happened to the men who died. They didn't volunteer to be anvils. They volunteered to fight, to defend freedom, to stop Hitler, to do something meaningful with their lives. Instead, they became strategic assets to be expended efficiently in service of someone else's glory. That's the betrayal at the heart of Operation Spring. Not that men died in combat, that's what happens in war. But that they died in combat designed to fail, attacking objectives they couldn't hold, sacrificing themselves for gains that were never meant to be permanent. They were brave. They were heroic. They were also expendable. And Montgomery knew it. Churchill knew it. Simonds probably suspected it. But the men in the Black Watch, advancing across that killing ground toward German positions that everyone knew they couldn't take? They believed. They believed in their commanders, in their mission, in the righteousness of their sacrifice. That belief was exploited. Used as fuel to power an operation whose success was measured not in what it gained but in what it cost the enemy's strategic flexibility. Is that wrong? In the abstract, yes. In the context of total war against Nazi Germany, maybe not. And that ambiguity, that fundamental uncertainty about whether the cost was justified, is what makes Operation Spring such a haunting example of command under pressure. Because here's the thing, it worked. The Germans committed their reserves. The American breakout succeeded. The Falaise pocket closed. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were trapped and captured or killed. The entire strategic situation in France shifted in a matter of days. And all of that happened, at least in part, because Montgomery spent the lives of Simonds' corps buying time and attention at Verrières Ridge. So from a purely utilitarian perspective, the greatest good for the greatest number, Montgomery made the right call. A few hundred Canadian casualties purchased a strategic breakthrough that saved thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of Allied lives and shortened the war by weeks or months. But from a moral perspective, the obligation to treat soldiers as ends in themselves rather than means to an end, Montgomery failed catastrophically. He violated the trust that soldiers place in their commanders. He exploited their courage and patriotism. He sent them to die not in service of victory but in service of strategy, which is a very different thing. Can both assessments be true simultaneously? Yes. And that's why command in war is both the highest expression of human organization and the most profound moral corruption imaginable. You have to be able to see men as statistics, lives as resources, courage as currency to be spent. And you have to be able to make that calculation while still remembering they're human beings with families and futures and infinite value as individuals. Most commanders can't do it. They break, either becoming too cautious and refusing to accept necessary casualties, or too callous and treating all lives as equally expendable. Montgomery walked that line better than most. He could calculate odds and accept losses while still understanding the human cost. But at Verrières Ridge he crossed a line. He didn't just accept casualties in pursuit of victory. He deliberately courted them in service of strategy. That's the distinction that matters. Soldiers die in war. That's tragic but inevitable. But when commanders deliberately design operations to maximize friendly casualties because those casualties serve a strategic purpose, that's something different. That's something darker. And that's what "you want me to sacrifice Simonds" really means. It's Montgomery acknowledging, if only to himself, that he's being asked to cross that line. To move from accepting casualties as a cost of victory to deliberately engineering casualties as a strategic tool. To use men's lives not to win battles but to lose them in ways that help someone else win different battles. Churchill didn't answer when Montgomery made that statement. He didn't need to. They both understood what was being asked. And they both understood it would never appear in the official record, never be acknowledged in public, never be discussed in terms that would make either of them look like the kind of men who could make such decisions. But make those decisions they did. And carry the consequences they must, whether in sleepless nights or quiet guilt or the simple knowledge that their professional success was built on sacrifices they engineered and then honored with medals and speeches while ensuring the full truth would never emerge. This is what we owe the veterans of Operation Spring. Not gratitude alone, though they deserve that. Not honors alone, though they earned them. But truth. The uncomfortable, complicated truth that they were used in ways they didn't understand, sacrificed in service of strategies they weren't told about, and expended efficiently in pursuit of objectives they never knew were secondary to someone else's breakthrough. Does acknowledging that diminish their sacrifice? No. If anything, it makes their courage more profound. They went forward anyway. Knowing or not knowing, understanding or not understanding, they did their duty. They attacked impossible positions. They paid impossible prices. They achieved impossible victories, even if those victories were never meant to be permanent. That's heroism. Real heroism. Not the sanitized version where brave men charge and win, but the harder truth where brave men charge and die and their deaths purchase something they'll never see. Montgomery used them. Churchill demanded it. Simonds led them. And they went because that's what soldiers do. They trust their commanders to use their lives wisely, to spend their courage carefully, to sacrifice them only when necessary and only in service of victory. Were those conditions met at Verrières Ridge? The strategic answer is yes. The moral answer is no. And we're left with the hardest truth of all. sometimes those answers don't converge, and when they don't, someone has to choose which matters more. Montgomery chose strategy. The men chose courage. And 50 years later, we're still arguing about whether either of them was wrong. That's the legacy of Operation Spring. Not victory or defeat, but moral ambiguity. Not heroism or tragedy, but both simultaneously. Not simple answers, but hard questions about what we owe soldiers, what commanders owe their men, and what prices can justifiably be paid in pursuit of victory. The men of the Black Watch deserved better than to be bait. But they were bait anyway. And their sacrifice, willing or not, knowing or not, helped win the war. That's worth remembering. All of it. The strategic necessity and the human cost. The brilliant planning and the moral corruption. The victory purchased and the price paid. Because if we forget, if we sanitize and simplify and reduce Operation Spring to a footnote in the glorious narrative of D-Day and liberation, then we dishonor the men who died there twice. Once when we sent them forward knowing they couldn't succeed. And again when we erased that knowledge from history to protect the reputations of the men who made that decision. They deserve better. They always did. And acknowledging the full, complicated truth of what happened to them is the only way we can begin to repay that debt. So when you hear about D-Day, when you watch the movies and read the books and celebrate the greatest generation, remember this. Behind every triumph there were disasters like Operation Spring. Behind every breakthrough there were sacrifices like Simonds' Corps. Behind every general's glory there were soldiers' graves. That doesn't make victory less valuable. It just makes it more expensive than anyone wants to admit. And that's the real story of what Montgomery said when Churchill used Canadians as bait. Not a simple tale of heroism or betrayal, but a complex tragedy of men making impossible choices under impossible pressure, spending lives they had no right to spend, and winning a war they could never have won any other way. The question isn't whether they were right. The question is whether we have the courage to remember what they actually did, rather than what we wish they had done.